What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 566. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. My brothers are actually visiting from California. They both took a road trip out here, 19 hours of driving, in order to come hang out for a week, and it is awesome. I haven't obviously seen them for now 7-8 months, something like that, since like before we got all kind of locked down here. So having them in town has just been incredible.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, Luis's brothers are awesome. They're two characters. They're not like Luis. They're all very different people.
Yes, they are.
But they're awesome, really. Like Luis sent me a picture yesterday when they got into town, and I was just like, oh my God, I want to see those guys. Like, yeah hanging out with them is it's really funny. Also, because they tell good stories about you from when you guys were kids, and broken coffee tables and coins being thrown into different cereal bowls and stuff. And for some reason, you don't volunteer that information. I have to get it from your brothers.
Maybe not so much.
Anyway, that's awesome that they're in town, and make sure to tell them hi for me. We are going to be doing our archetype deep dive. We picked the 3 best archetypes in the format to go over today, so we're going to be going in depth on those. So if you haven't had a chance to draft them, or if you've drafted them and you're going, why isn't this working for me? We're going to fix it for you today here on the show, get you set right on, again, what I think are the 3, or what we think are the 3 best archetypes in the format. Before we do, I got to mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. They've got Magic Fest in a Box is back, and they've got a bunch of cool stuff in it. It's $99.99 for one of these things, and you get a mystery Ultra Pro Magic Fest playmat, a combo of an Ultra Pro Commander size decks and 100 sleeves, and you get a foil Soul Ring and a non-foil Soul Ring promo. You get 2 foil Path to Exile and 4 non-foil Path to Exile promos. You get 4 non-foil Lightning Bolt promos, a foil Mutavault promo, and 10 foil basic land promos. So it's like you went to like 3 Magic Fests in a row and just got all the cool stuff from it. They're $99.99. You can bling out your commander deck. You can upgrade your cube, whatever it is that you want to use all the cool shinies for. You can find them over at Channel Fireball. There's a big banner at the top of the site right now, and you can click through to see that. The Patreon as well. Of course, the show is brought to you by you, our listeners, directly via the Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. All the info's over there. I've told you about it before. I'll save it for this time. Now, one of the things you do get, though, by being a patron, one of the many things, is you get to ask questions on our Patreon Question of the Week threads. I just refreshed the thread, and we got a question here from Matt who says, I have 2 submissions. First question, what's the biggest difference between playing in a competitive format, like at a GP or a Mythic Championship, versus on the arena ladder? Are there effects you would prioritize higher or lower based on that? What is the biggest difference, Luis, between playing on the ladder versus playing, in a professional level competitive event?
I think that you can get a better read on the metagame for professional level events. Just the ladder, I find, is the popular decks tend to be a little more overrepresented, and especially whatever the most popular deck is, I feel like I tend to face that way more often than its actual metagame share. Though obviously that's complicated by the fact that we've had some kind of bad formats recently where one deck is 60% of the metagame.
Or 72.
The other thing is the quality of opponents in play can vary wildly. Sometimes you face, excellent players, kind of match after match, and sometimes you face people who, especially the funny thing is once they get to Mythic, you face people who they might be good, but they are not playing good decks because some people really like to just test whatever it is they feel like playing, which is totally fine. I think that's part of the fun of it, but it means that I've found ladder to be kind of not great practice for professional level events that I care about. In general, I don't think I would change your approach too much. Like the ladder will give you some good feedback on whether your deck is good or not, but I think that you can probably make more accurate predictions when you have got even a Grand Prix. I would feel more comfortable playing a control deck, based on what I expect there than the ladder.
How would you compare average level of the competitor to the ladder versus like a Pro Tour?
The average Mythic player on the ladder is, I think, quite a bit less strong than the average competitor Pro Tour, but probably equivalent to around a GP Day 2 of quality, which is very good still.
It's good.
Like, we're talking, when I say that is less than a Pro Tour, I mean less than the top 200 players, in
the world,
in the entire world, but closer to like the top 1,500 players in the world or something, which is still very, very good. So that said, the road to Mythic can be pretty long, and at some of the like lower levels, you're just going to have a lot of different people in different skill levels. So again, it just depends what your goals are. Sure. There's no judgments here, right or wrong.
And then the other question from Matt is: besides Magic, what's been your longest running hobby or interest?
For you, it's probably basketball.
Definitely.
For me, I think it's probably D&D, like Dungeons and Dragons.
Luis is like, besides Magic, what does that mean?
Well, for me, I would say like the top 3 things I like in that sense are like Magic, D&D, and cooking. But I actually, funnily enough, I actually started playing D&D before I learned how to cook. I really didn't learn how to cook until I was in my 20s, like at least not well. Whereas I started playing D&D about the same time I started playing Magic. It wasn't too far different.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it's definitely basketball. I kind of fell in love with it when I was about 13, and I basically haven't stopped playing since. I mean, I've had some long breaks, like even a couple of times where it was like a couple of years where I wasn't playing. But for the most part, I've played through that, and I continue to up until the pandemic. I haven't been able to play since then, which is a bummer. But it's actually the thing I miss the most, because I really love playing basketball, but other like running exercises or things like that, I hate. Like I'm always just like, this hurts and I don't like this. But when I play basketball, I don't think about that stuff as much. So, yeah, that's definitely been my number one passion in my whole life, I think, is basketball for sure. I still watch it and all that stuff too. Congratulations to the GOAT, by the way, for winning the championship. Okay, let's do a crack-a-pack here. Zendikar Rising crack-a-pack. We've got one lined up here. Our first card out of the pack is Core Celebrant, a card we'll be talking about today. That's the 2 and a white, 1/4. Whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. This is probably one of the cards that's gained the most since the set review, right? These type of cards are generally like filler level cards where you can play them in a defensive deck and not be embarrassed, but you don't really prioritize them. But that's not been the case in Zendikar Rising. This card is a priority for the Clerics deck. It's actually very strong.
Oh yeah, it's actually worth celebrating. It is a really good defensive body. It immediately gains you a life. So if you've played your life gain payoffs before it, playing it afterwards works. It also triggers them immediately. So if you play like a Scion of the Storm or of the Swarm rather, the 5-mana 3/3 that gains counter whenever you gain life, you can just play that. This will trigger. It'll immediately go up to a 4/4. So I found Core Celebrant to be quite strong. Though one of the cool things about Zendikar is it's very strong in the black-white Clerics deck. Like I wouldn't be ashamed to first pick that if I was in that deck. Though I don't really want to first pick this pack one because I don't want to kind of tunnel vision that hard. But it's like not playable in the Warriors deck, in the red-white Warriors deck, and it's mediocre in the blue-white Party deck. It's still certainly playable there, but especially if you're on the more controlling Flyers side. But it's still not something you're really looking at, and it's just not playable in the green-white deck for the most part. So I really like it when cards have such high variable value, and Core Celebrant's one that is very good in the black-white Clerics deck and fairly poor outside of it.
It's somehow almost a gold card. It's weird. Never thought of it like that. But yeah, excellent card. Really much, much higher than I would have anticipated. Next is Shell Shield, which is the blue instant. Creature gets +0/+3, and you can kick it for an additional mana to give it hexproof. Card's also more playable than I thought, not to the level of Core Celebrant, but it does actually make its way into some of my kicker decks and occasionally into a rogues deck as well, which surprised me a little bit. I'm generally not a huge fan of cards like this, and this isn't a particularly great version of it. The thing you really want is hexproof, and you have to pay the extra mana to get it, where the +0/+3 does matter for combat and burn spells sometimes, but the hexproof would generally be the one that I'd prefer to have up front. So this is a slightly nerfed version. But the fact that I play this card ever surprises me, because it just is a fairly low impact card overall. But it turns out a cheap instant speed kicker, that can mess with your Risen Riptides and stuff like that, where you can attack with them and your opponent doesn't know if they're going to be 5s. 5/8s, I guess, or 5/5s, at instant speed. And of course, just the normal mode of saving your creatures and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think Spell Shield's fine.
It's okay. Subtle Strike is next. 1 and a black instant. Choose one or both. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. This one usually doesn't end up making the cut for me, even though I do consider it a playable. It's right on that fringe. This one often is my 25th card, or sometimes it's my 22nd card if I didn't quite pick up enough removal. There's plenty of targets for the -1/-1, but it's still just mediocre compared to the other removal options in black.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I do think that the fact that the black-green counters deck isn't very good does mean I don't prioritize this. Like, that's where this was supposed to be an all-star.
Yep.
I've been wrecked by this enough to respect it, but I'm not really excited about taking any of these cards or playing them so far.
Same. Strength of Solidarity is a card I never play. It's green sorcery. Choose target creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter for each creature in your party. Maybe more evidence that the +1/+1 counter deck just kind of failed, because I never play this card.
Oh, yeah. I do not think this card's good.
Yep. Next is Bubble Snare. This is a good one. Blue enchantment. It's got kicker for 2 and a blue. And enchants a creature. The creature doesn't untap during its untap step, and if you kick it, you tap the creature. Very good card. Little awkward, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because one of the archetypes we're going to talk about today is Blue-Red Wizards, and it doesn't actually go into that deck particularly well. But this is, for most cases, hard removal in blue, and sometimes it's hard removal for just a single blue, which is excellent.
I wouldn't describe it as not going into the Wizards deck well. Like, it doesn't achieve what the Wizards deck is primarily trying to achieve, but I've never cut a Bubble Snare from Wizards.
Me too.
It does mean that you'll pick it on a slightly different level maybe in that deck, but Bubble Snare is excellent. I'm not unhappy to first pick a Bubble Snare.
Yeah, it's where you pick it that if I have it in my pile, it's going in any blue deck. And it would be my pick here. Expedition of Skulker is a 1 and a black 2/2. If you control a rogue, it gets Death Touch. It's a playable. That's about it. Rabid Bite is next. 1 and a black sorcery, 1 and a green sorcery. Your creature fights, or bites, I should say, another creature. Good card.
I'm on Bubble Snare over Rabid Bite here.
Definitely.
But Rabid Bite's also a solid early pick. I haven't loved it just because I found that even in green decks, sometimes you don't have the biggest creatures. And
that can happen, yeah.
And I don't want to end up in a spot where the Rabid Bite doesn't do enough, but it's a card I'm, of course, happy to play.
Yeah, it combos well with the landfall creatures that are like temporarily bigger, that kind of stuff. Next is Adventure Awaits, and we'll just let it keep waiting because we're not taking it. Scavenge Blade. This one's really disappointed. It just never really seems to do what you want. The 1 in a red equipment, the creature gets +2/+0, and of course it attaches itself to a creature when it ETBs. The equip cost, though, is really expensive. It's 2 in a red.
Yeah, I think that Scavenge Blade is a card I would try to avoid playing. The only thing I like it with is Flame Blade Charger, the 1/1 haster, that when it dies deals damage equal to its power.
It has haste if it's equipped, yeah.
Right, if it's equipped. Mm-hmm. Putting Scavenge Blade on that is an actual good play, and it really makes you get some good value. So I would play Scavenge Blade if I had like 1 or 2 of those in a Warriors deck that needed it, but for the most part, it's just not a very strong card.
Malachur Blood Priest is the 1 in a black 2/1. When it ETBs, it drains your opponent for X life, where X is the number of creatures in your party. It's a critical piece for the Clerics deck. It doesn't really go elsewhere, although people do play it in other color pairs, like red-black party. I've seen people play Blood Priest, and it's been fine there too.
Yeah, I was going to mention exactly that deck because I have found it to be quite good there, because that deck not only gets to 3 more often than most decks, sometimes even 4, but it also can use the drain effect. It's funny because the red-black party deck is primarily aggressive, but you can get a more controlling version, and the Blood Priest is actually fine in either one because the gaining 3 when you drain them for 3 is pretty important. So yeah, I'm a pretty big fan of the Malachur Blood Priest, and I would take Bubble Snare over it, but Blood Priest would be second here for me.
Yeah, I think I'm Bubble Snare Celebrant Blood Priest, maybe. I don't know. Whatever.
I like Blood Priest over Celebrant just because I think it's good in red-black and even playable in black-blue. Because one of the cool things is in black-blue, it's going to fill out a creature type you don't have much of, Cleric.
Right.
So your Rogues deck is easily going to have a Rogue and sometimes even have like a Wizard in play. True. So this is drain 2, drain 3, and the Rogues deck can be aggressive. So yeah, I think it's a more flexible card, though I agree with you that in black-white Clerics, I'd rather have the Celebrant than the Blood Priest for the most part.
Okay, well, let's just put all of those cards aside, all of them, and probably all the ones for the rest of the pack, because, Luis, we got a Rooster Drakes, baby. The mythic uncommon for the set, blue. It's got kicker 2 and a blue. When ETBs, you make a 2/2 flyer. If you kicked it, whenever you cast a kick spell, you get a 2/2 flyer. Busted. Oh, yeah. This card's so crazy.
It's funny because, like, it's a really good build-around, but because it has kicker itself, it also just enables all your other kicker build-arounds, and worst comes to worst is a 4-mana 2/2 flyer.
I know.
So it's just wild how much this card does, while also being in a mechanic that's really well supported. Like the blue-green kicker decks are one of the decks we're going to talk about today because that deck is very good.
That's right. And this is the best. Yeah, this is on the shortest list of best build-arounds I've ever seen. So it might be the best build-around I've seen. Yeah, Rooster Drakes. That's probably going to be our pick. Next is Concerted Defense. That's the blue instant. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1 additional for each creature in your party. Did you say that we're supposed to look at this card or something? I don't want to even look at this card.
I don't think it's good,
trash.
But I know that Deathsea was experimenting playing it and had a couple games where it was good. But when asked, "Do you think this card is good?" he was like, "Well, I'm not going to go that far."
Okay, yeah. I mean,
I enjoy the experimenting. Trust me.
Yeah, and this is the type of card that late in a format you can get somebody with. Like nobody is ever playing against the uncommon 1-mana conditional counterspell, right? Like I'm just like, if you have it, I tip my hat because you put Concerted Defense in your draft deck and got me. Next is Song Mad Treachery. That's the land, but on the front side, it's 3 red sorcery, and it lets you steal a creature, untap it, and the creature gains haste. That's a solid double face card, but it's nowhere near Rooster Drakes.
No. Rooster Drakes is going to blank everything except the rare slot, and even then, it's unlikely that we take the rare over Rooster Drakes.
And that is extremely unlikely that we take this rare. It's Nahiri's Lithoforming. It's the red X sorcery, sack X lands. For each land sacrifice this way, draw a card. You may play X additional lands this turn. Lands you control enter the battlefield tapped this turn.
Yeah, not a card I tend to play, but I think in the landfall deck, it actually can do something. If you have one landfall creature out, this is kind of like a huge pump spell. And if you have, like, let's say you had a Coom Hellhound and a Lagak in play, a Spitfire Lagak, and you just cast this for 4 and put 3 lands into play, yeah, we're talking some real work there. So I wouldn't throw Lithoforming into the trash, but of course it's worse than Rooster Drakes, also worse than Bubble Snare, also worse than Malachur Blood Priest. Like
Rabid Bite, Celebrant.
I'm saying this card's not good, but I'm saying you are doing yourself a disservice if you call it unplayable, Okay. So just keep the card in mind, but obviously it's not a card we're going to take here and it's actually not even like the 3rd or 4th card we would take here. Right.
So Rooster Drakes, it is windmill slam it on the table with a big smile on your face because you just opened one of the better cards in the whole set. Okay, so let's get into the decks here. The first one we're going to start with is, I think, just the best archetype in the format, and it's one that we have touched on a prior show on our initial. What do we call that show?
Yeah, just the first impressions show.
First impressions, that's right. First impression show. But now, having really drafted the heck out of this thing, we can go a bit deeper, and it is black-white Clerics. I think it's best deck in the format. It has a really strong base of commons, and an interesting thing about this archetype is that within those commons, there are both enablers and payoffs mixed in, which isn't always the case. Sometimes the payoffs are either very slim to none in the commons, and you'll only find them in the uncommons and the rares. But here, there's actually some of each. And when you go up in rarity, like to the uncommons and rares, they get even better. There's still payoffs there, and they do get better. And then besides this highly synergistic package that you get access to great removal from these two colors, particularly black, but white has Nahiri's Binding as well and a few other more conditional removal spells. But you get the premium removal in this color pair, and you get access to really all of it as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. Key commons. Core Celebrant at common is absolutely, to me, it's the most important common. It's the one that if I see it, I will take it over the other non-removal commons, like the other Clerics or whatever for the thing. Where are you at on that? We just talked about the where did it go? Why isn't it on here? Oh wait, Marauding Blight Priest? No, Malachur. Where are you?
Malachur Blood Priest is right above Marauding.
Oh, there it
Blood
is.
Priest
Sorry, yeah. I thought I had Celebrant in that group. Okay, yeah. So Malachur Blood Priest. I have Celebrant on its own. Would you group the Blood Priest with it?
So the way I look at it, first of all, just like you kind of mentioned, in our key commons for these decks, we're not including like Deadly Alliance because that is kind of outside the archetype and is just the best black common. You're just going to take Deadly Alliances whenever you see them and be lucky you have them. For the black-white clerics, it's actually a little interesting because Feed the Swarm, the 1 black, kill a creature or enchantment and lose like life equal to its cost. Mm-hmm. That is a removal spell, which is kind of outside this deck entirely. But it also is a card that specifically gets better in this deck.
Yes.
Like most draft decks, like for example, a blue-black rogues deck, I'll happily play the first Feed the Swarm. The second one, I'm usually not going to take super highly because that deck doesn't have any life gain usually. You're not really in a position to cast a spell that makes you lose 4, then another one that makes you lose 5 or whatever. So I'm a little skeptical of the second and would just basically not play a third. Whereas in the black-white deck, the first 2 are great and the third is still good. So I think Feed the Swarm is a little higher than all the creatures here for the most part. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is I would take Core Celebrant over Malachur Blood Priest if I was black-white clerics. In a pack like the one we just saw where we're in a position to first pick it, I would rather take the Blood Priest just because it's a little bit more flexible and I want to keep my options open. I, in general, do think that if you're in, we're going to look at this as the framework of once you're in this deck. And the way you get into these decks is usually one of the uncommons, or it's something like, we've seen plenty of drafts where you're like, well, I'm going to first pick a Deadly Alliance because it's the best card. I'm going to second pick whether it's like a Nahiri's Binding or maybe just another black card, and then third pick you're like, oh, here's a Core Celebrant. Yep. Okay, this is a time to kind of look into taking these cards. And once you're in black-white clerics, I think that Core Celebrant's the most important of the cleric commons, and I often would take it over Feed the Swarm, but I think those 2 cards are pretty close, and Deadly Alliance generally is going to beat both of those just because that card is just so good.
Right. And then I have Malachur Blood Priest, Marauding Blight Priest, and Shepherd of Heroes kind of in that next tier. These are cards that you'll basically play as many of as you can get, and you'll prioritize them over everything but the cards that Luis mentioned, like the Celebrant and the removal spells, plus, a couple of other cards we'll talk about in a minute, like Relic Vial and things like this that kind of turbocharge this deck. But of the common, creatures for the deck, Blood Priest, Blight Priest, and Shepherd, I just want as many as I can get. Then the next tier of them is like Angel Heart Protector. That's the 3/2 for 2 and a white. It gives something indestructible. It's a cleric that's a 3/2 with a relevant ETB ability. Similar is like a Stonework Pack Beast or something like that. I'll also play Expedition Healer in that group, as well as Ghastly Gloomhunter. Gloomhunter's the bat that has kicker, and Healer's the 2/2 for 2 with vigilance, and it gets lifelink if you have a cleric. These are all cards that you want in there. I have Protector just maybe slightly better than those, but basically in the same group. And then there's a really important card that I want to point out here that isn't normally on my radar, but Blood Beckoning. That's the 1 black or 3 and a black with the kicker to get back a creature or 2 creatures back from your yard, basically. And it is excellent in this deck. I usually aim to have 2 Blood Beckonings in this deck. And that's because your creatures die. Sometimes you're even sacrificing them, so you know that they're going to the graveyard for sure. And it's all about the enter the battlefield triggers for the most part. So like, you play a Malachur Blood Priest, let's say it triggers for 2, you get the drain, you gain a life, it puts a counter on something and you feel happy about it. Then you trade it off for their 2/2, and now it's going to be in the graveyard. Well, if you can buy that back with another creature and then recast it, you get to trigger all of those things again. And those triggers are really the name of the game for this deck. So to me, Blood Beckoning is a key piece of the equation, and in any of these decks, I aim to have either 2 Blood Beckoning or 1 Thwart the Grave and 1 Blood Beckoning. Thwart the Grave is an uncommon, so you won't see it as often, though it's more powerful, generally speaking. But it's interesting because, there's another card that you would think is somewhat similar in this color, and that's, what is it called?
Blood Price.
Blood Price, right? And Blood Price on its surface looks like a perfectly serviceable card. You even might think it's better in this deck because you lose some life and that doesn't hurt you as bad in a deck where you're gaining a bunch of life. but I've tried it out and I want Blood Beckoning every time. Like I would snap trade that off every single time for a Blood Price.
I basically only play Blood Price in these decks if I can't get Blood Beckonings, because I think Blood Beckoning is much better.
Right.
Also of note, Blood Priest goes up in value for me once I have a Blood Beckoning, and especially once I have a second, because then the game's all about just trying to play two, get back both, play two, get back both. Mm-hmm. The only difference I have in pick order from you, I think, is that I have Expedition Healer and Pack Beast above Angel Heart Protector, the 3-mana 3/2, because this deck ends up with a lot of 3-drops. Marauding, Blight Priest, and Core Celebrant are both much better 3-drops than Angel Heart Protector, and I really want something to play on 2. And Expedition Healer in particular, the 2-mana 2/2 lifelink Vigilance if you have a Cleric, or Vigilance lifelink if you have a Cleric, is really good with Blood Beckoning in that it buys you time, it does all the things you want this deck to do, and so I think that the Protector is fine. I just think it's worse than all the other 2-drops just because you just need to fill out the 2 curve. It's especially effective when you go to like turn 2 Ghastly Gloomhunter, turn 3 Cleric of Lifespawn. Like that's a really good sequence that you end up with a 3/3 on turn.
God dang it. Boo. I recognized it right away too. I'm like, oh, I did that backwards.
Yes, you did. And my job is to never let you forget.
Yeah, good. I'm so glad you were watching.
I mean, we're joking about the 3-on-3 we did against Lords of Limited, and Marshall's deck was actually excellent. You had a basically ideal black-white Clerics deck, though, funnily enough. Your deck would have been better if you could switch out 2 Angel Heart Protectors for 2 of the Expedition Healers, because you had like 6 3-drops or something, and that's just kind of how these decks end up.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's kind of where all the commons end up. This deck's a creature-heavy deck, and that's part of the reason Blood Beckoning is good as well. This is frequently like an 18-creature, 16-creature deck. It's not like one of the Rogues decks or Wizards decks that'll have 9, 10 creatures.
Right. And one thing I want to point out about these commons is you line them up, and I mentioned it at the beginning, but it's really important, and I think it's the reason why this deck excels over the others, is you get a bunch of Clerics, and all of the common Clerics are playable. All of them. You can put any of the common. There's not one where you're like, ugh. Like Pack Beast is probably the worst, I guess. I don't know. But here's the thing. You get Marauding Blight Priest, right? This is the 3/2, and whenever you gain life, it drains your opponent for 1. And you get Malachur Blood Priest, which again cares about, party and that kind of stuff. So those are payoffs. And you also get enablers. You get Expedition Healer, you get Ghastly Gloomhunter, and most importantly, you get Core Celebrant as like the premium enabler. So if these are the only creatures that you have, you can win the game with this. Like you can cast Blood Priest with the Celebrant out and a Marauding Blight Priest out. Just 3 random commons, right? And it's like trigger, drain you for 2, gain 2 life, you lose another 1, and then you lose another 1, right? And it's like, wow, I am doing it. You got a whole screen full of triggers and all you've cast are commons. If you move up, the payoffs get really good. You get Cleric of Lifespawn. That's the the white-black uncommon 2/2 that we just talked about. You get Attended Healer. These are only uncommons, by the way. Which is the 2/3 for 4, but you could pay 2 and a white to give another Cleric lifelink, and then whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, you make a 1/1. That's insane. And then you get Scion of the Swarm, the card that Luis talked about earlier, the 3/3 flyer for 3 black, and whenever you gain life, it picks up a counter. And then most important of all, you get Relic Vial, which is the artifact that we've liked quite a bit. Both that one and the Wizards one have turned out to be absolutely fantastic. And Relic Vial is built for this deck. It even has a Clerics-based clause in it that allows you to draw extra cards. And it's amazing. So, and again,
drain extra, not draw extra.
Drain extra. You draw the card normally, right? The drawing extra cards is actually is you have to go to rare for that, the 2/2 flyer. But anyway, these are just uncommons. We haven't even gone into the rares. I'm not going to bother, but they're all excellent there too. But these are like really premium payoffs that make the deck just completely absurd. And if you can package all of this stuff up with some good removal spells, you're going to have, again, what I think is the best deck in the format.
Yeah, it's funny because this deck does do a lot of work in the common slot, but I don't think I've ever ended up black-white Clerics without having at least one of the uncommons, and usually in the like 2 to 4 range. Obviously, if you're at 4 or 5, good uncommons, the deck's going to be busted. But if you, even with 2, like imagine a deck that has 1 Relic Vial, 1 Cleric of Life's Bond, and a decent swath of the commons, the deck's going to be very good.
Yep.
Main thing to look out for is just seeing like a 4th pick Relic Vial when you already have 2 black cards. Seeing a Cleric of Life's Bond 4th or 5th, like anywhere in that range. Attended Healer and Sign of the Swarm are not quite as high priority. Those are much less rewarding than the other payoffs. But still, if you see a 6-pick Sign of the Swarm and you've got, let's say, 4 black cards, a red card, and a blue card, you're not 100% sure where you're going, I'm snapping up the Sign and looking to potentially move into a black-based Clerics deck.
Yeah, I really like Attended Healer. I agree Scion of the Swarm isn't quite as on that level for sure. Card type breakdown, as you mentioned, 12 to 18 creatures, depending on how things plan out, how your removal came together. In this format, 17 to 20 lands, but I'm counting some number of those lands as being modal double-face cards. You don't need any combat tricks in this archetype. Just don't put them in the deck at all. 3+ removal spells. I mean, the sky's the limit. How lucky are you, basically?
You can just have like 6 removal. It's not that uncommon.
You totally can. So take them and play them. It's great. I always want 2 graveyard recursion effects, namely Blood Beckoning or Thwart the Grave. And then, you have some room for some non-creature payoffs, 1 or 2 of those, like a Relic Vial or something like that as well.
I do want to note that even though we don't like Blood Price as much, if you're in a spot where you haven't picked up any Blood Beckonings or Thwarts, then just play your Blood Price. Because what this deck does is gain a lot of life and prolong the game. It needs a way to get card advantage. Relic Vial can do that, because Relic Vial, it doesn't get you card advantage exactly, but if they ever target your stuff with removal, you're up a card. It also lets you cash in your worst stuff for cards and still get the ETB effects, which is kind of like pseudo card advantage. But you really do need that Blood Beckoning in order to pull ahead of your opponent. So Blood Price really does do the job if you've got nothing better to do. And the good thing is you'll pick those up easily. No one really wants it.
Right. Exactly. And then cards you should be valuing higher for this archetype. We talked about Feed the Swarm. That's the number 1. Blood Beckoning is high on that list as well, but really, you can play 3 Feed the Swarm, like Luis said. Like, you are getting unconditional removal for 2 mana in this deck that you could play 3 and not really worry about it. So this is the only deck in the format that can get away with that. So that's excellent. We mentioned Blood Beckoning. Then any Cleric. It's funny. I think the only one that I'm really kind of bummed about is the uncommon, the Kitesail Cleric, the flyer.
Yeah,
I'm always
so that's the 1 mana, 1/1 flying, and then you can kick it for 2 and a white and tap 2 creatures when it ETBs. Yeah, that's more of a red-white card. The only time I've played that in black-white Clerics is when I have like 2 Relic Vials. Because once you have 2 Relic Vials, you're fine just putting any little chumper into play, blocking and draining them.
Yep, that's right. And then the last card that I actually do often put 1 copy of, and it's better than I thought it would be, is Mind Drain. That's a 2 and a black. They discard 2, mill 2, lose life, you gain a life. You do get a life gain trigger off of it, and oftentimes the game is stalled out on the board and you can get the last 2 cards out of their hand fairly frequently. And the times when you can't, you're at least at the very minimum going to get that life gain. So if you got one of those and you're struggling on your last card to put in, it's okay to put a Mind Drain in. It is definitely not a priority. It's not like Blood Beckoning or Feed the Swarm. It's just, I think I had it on the unplayable side of the fence, and it's just a little bit on the, it's a 23rd card for this deck that I found better than I thought.
I think I'm a little higher on it than you are. I too kind of started out like, all right, where's Mind Rot going to fit this time? Because Mind Rot is, can vary wildly. I think this is the best Mind Rot format I've ever seen. I'm like happy playing Mind Drain. So I think that it's not a card I really want in an aggressive deck, but I think it fits really nicely into Clerics and really nicely into Rogues, and even the red-black party deck it's fine in. So yeah, I'm high on Mind Drain. I'm happy to play it, and that's one of the cards actually that can make me not worry about playing Blood Price either, because Mind Drain is your card advantage. You just need some way to leverage the fact that you're living through everything and get ahead on cards as the game progresses, because you're not killing them very fast.
Yeah, I think the issue I've had is that I've had a hard time in these Cleric decks finding room. Like, I usually can fit 1 Mind Drain because I don't want to cut a Cleric for
decks will not play Mind Drain.
Right.
The best Cleric decks will they have everything all rolled up. They're like, all right, I'm all Clerics, removal, and Relic Vials. We got this.
Let's do this.
But Mind Drain is a good way to get ahead of your opponent when you don't have all the pieces you would optimally have.
I only draft the best, Luis. I don't.
Yeah, that's
premium Clerics decks or nothing. And by the way, early in the format, when I was doing my videos for CFB, you would think that because the deck wasn't well known enough and we were pretty early on it. And I just drafted it for like 3 drafts in a row and crushed with it.
I mean, so literally awesome. My first Zendikar draft video for CFB, I had 3 Cleric of Lifespawn and 2 Relic Vials.
Let's try this out and see if it's any good. All right, our next one, and I think probably the 3rd best archetype in the format, if I had to rank them, is Blue-Red Wizards. The Wizards deck, basically every card that you want to play in blue and in red will trigger the various payoffs for this archetype. And you get a good mix of like threats and disruption. And then the common creatures are pretty strong in the color pair too. They're not on the level of black-white. You do have to dip down a little lower, but they're pretty darn good. And you can put together some pretty nice stuff. For the key commons. So let me know what you think about this, Luis. So I have number 1 key common is Royal Eruption. And I know we don't normally put the removal spells in here, because it's also the best common in the whole set. So, why would we need to put that in? As a listener of the show, you already know, hey, I'm going to take Royal Eruption if I see it over Tazim Royal Mage first pick or something. But it, and then another card that I have 1 tier down is Into the Royal. I put them in because they actually trigger all the things that this deck cares about, where it's either instant sorcery or wizard card, and these fit into that as well. I don't know. Do you think we should have these on the list, or are they still just self-explanatory where we don't need to have them on here?
Oh, I actually think it's worth mentioning Royal Eruption and Into the Royal specifically because they are not only great commons in and of themselves, as you discussed, they really do make the wizard deck pop, like to the point where a wizard deck that has 2 Royal Eruptions and an Into the Royal is going to be so much better than a wizard deck that just is lacking on those fronts, because the wizard deck takes these already great commons and makes them better. Whereas like something like Deadly Alliance, it's not really elevated in the Clerics deck. No. It's good, but it's just as good in any black deck. In fact, it's slightly better in the black-red deck because that deck most often casts it for 2 mana. Whereas Royal Eruption in the Wizards deck not only does all the good things Royal Eruption normally does, but it triggers your Spells Matter cards. You can get it back with Tazim Royal Mage, which you already want in the deck. If you've got the rare like Kaza or whatever, you can make it cheaper to kick and cast. So it is worth mentioning that these cards are significantly better in this deck than they would be otherwise, even if everyone's going to want to first pick them anyway, and you're not really like getting any edge there. It's not like the Clerics deck that gets an edge by getting to play 3 Feed the Swarms. The Wizard deck doesn't get an edge by making these cards better in the sense that everyone drafts them, but it is worth noting how good these cards are. And Royal Eruption and Into the Royal, I think, are just the top 2 commons for the deck, and I don't even think it's particularly close. It's just so good in the deck. Yeah,
they're also 2 of the top 3 or 4 commons in the whole set, and they're grouped into this 1 color pair, so you get that. So Royal Eruption to me is easily number 1. Number 2 would be Into the Royal. And then when we start talking about the actual wizard cards, I like Expedition Diviner a lot at the common slot. That card to me has overperformed. That's a 3/2 flyer for 3 and a blue. And when it dies, you can draw a card if you control another wizard.
Yeah, Expedition Diviner is very good. It's one of the payoffs for having all your creatures be wizards, where you get to play the Snapping Drake with upside, which is really sweet. It's
actually, I think, the only actual payoff at common. And again, this is the interesting part, right? Like if you look at the black-white deck, they have 2 at least payoffs and a bunch of enablers. But here it's more like enablers, like these things are wizards or are instants or sorceries, but they don't give you anything for doing it. And Diviner does. It says if you're in the wizards deck, then you do have a benefit because you can trade this off and draw a card, or if they use removal, you can draw a card. And it's a card that they actually want to trade or kill. Like, some cards that have that ability, your opponent can ignore, but a 3/2 flyer, they can't. So that's your main one. Then there's another grouping of Cunning Geyser Mage. Oh, go ahead, Luis.
I do have one other note, which is that Chilling Trap is actually a really good Wizards payoff. That's the 1 mana.
Well, that's in the next group.
So instant. Well, you mentioned there's no Wizards payoff at common.
Gotcha. Yes, you're right.
It is an actual card that cares about Wizards at common, and I think it's actually one of the stronger reasons to be in the deck. But we'll talk about that in this upcoming group.
No, you're totally right. And I actually meant to put that in here, but did not. So I'm glad you caught that. So cards like Cunning Geyser Mage, it's a wizard, and it has kickers, so it has this great flexibility. Tazim Royal Mage, same thing, but even better because of the Spells Matter sub-theme here with this deck to get you those cards back, especially Royal Eruption and Into the Royal. And then, Luis, great call, Chilling Trap as well. being in here, this is the only deck that wants Chilling Trap at all. And it works on 2 axes in the deck. It is an instant so that it triggers the cards that care about that. And then it makes itself into a cantrip if you control a wizard. And Chilling Trap as a cantrip is great. It's really, really good. Like, even in your worst case scenario where somebody's attacking you with a 4-power creature and you can't block it and you just make it 0 power for the turn, draw a card, and maybe get a trigger off of one of your payoffs, that's excellent for 1 mana. And the upside is great too, where, how many times do they attack you with their 5/4 and you're like, double block, shrink it, right? And now your Chilling Trap is a cantripping removal spell for 1 mana, which also triggers some of your other stuff.
Or just 1 mana, gain 4, draw a card.
Yes.
Because you just shrink their creature that's about to hit you. So Chilling Trap's in a weird spot. So this is not like Feed the Swarm, which is a good card in every deck and a great card in Clerics. Mm-hmm. This card's a straight 0 outside of Wizards, yes, but good in Wizards. This is what you look for when you're drafting these decks, because this gives you a decided advantage. We're talking arbitrage here, where no one else wants this card. You want this card, and it's good in your deck. But you also don't want to like third pick it, even if you would normally, because you can almost always wheel it. One of the biggest strengths of this deck is when you're getting up to the point where you have like 6 or 7 Wizards, Chilling Traps you can just assume are pretty close to just being on, or you have to wait a little while, and that's fine too. And I would play up to like 5 Chilling Traps in my deck if you had space. Yes. And at that point, once you're at that many, you also want to just up your creature count because you want to get into more combats. But Chilling Trap is a very good reward. It also just means your late game Tazim Royal Mages can always pick up a cantrip. It just does all the things you want to do. It charges up your Rockslide Sorcerers and Relic Amulets really, really easily. One of the more brutal ways you can lose to this deck is, and I've had this literal scenario happen where I curve out and they play a Relic Amulet, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the 2 mana artifact that gets a charge counter every time you play a wizard, instant, or sorcery, and then you can pay 2 tap, remove all the counters to shoot a creature for that much. Mm-hmm. So they're behind on board because they spent a turn playing a Relic Amulet. I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to play my 3rd creature. I'm going to see if I can just kill them before it catches up to me that they're getting to pick off my creatures for free. But then I make this attack and they're like, Chilling Trap your biggest creature, put a counter on the amulet, take no damage from that creature, shoot one of your other creatures. Oh, God. And then it all just starts going downhill from there, where Chilling Trap it's like the perfect card for them, while also maybe blocking one of your creatures and then shrinking that creature. So I don't think you can overstate how important Chilling Trap is to the deck, despite it not being really a high pick for anyone else or even for you, because you can get them 7th to 12th picks or even later sometimes pretty easily. Yeah,
so really an important one as a payoff here at the common slot. Next group has kind of your bread and butter wizards like Ardent Electromancer, which has performed a little better than I thought it would, but still not great. Fisher Wizard, same. And then like a Pack Beast. And then also I do play Glacial Grasp in this deck.
Yeah, same.
For similar reasons to Chilling Trap. It's much worse than Chilling Trap, generally speaking, but it can do a good job of keeping your opponent off balance.
It's a 3-mana Chilling Trap instead of a 1-mana Chilling Trap.
Instead of 1 mana, yeah. But of course, that brings us to the payoffs, right? And there are some really great ones at Uncommon. Top 2 for me are Rockslide Sorcerer. That's the 3 and a red 3/3. Whenever you do an instant wizard or sorcery, it does a damage to anything. And Relic Amulet that Luis just talked about. Those 2 are extremely powerful in this deck, especially because it's not that hard to have basically your whole entire deck either be wizards, sorceries, or instants. Like you count up what you've got, and Relic Amulet is one of the very few cards that you really want to put in your deck in this color pair that aren't one of those things. You might get a really great, non-wizard creature that you want to play occasionally. But for the most part, you can fill up your deck with Pack Beasts and Fisher Wizards and all this stuff. And the Sorcerer is insane, and the Amulet's even better somehow. So those are great.
Yeah.
The Signpost Uncommon is really good. It's Umara Mystic. That's the 1/3 flyer for 1 blue-red. Gets +2/+0 anytime you cast one of those 3 types. That's fantastic. It's kind of a must deal with threat. And then you get really powerful stuff like Windrider Wizard as well. That's the 2/2 flyer for 2 and a blue. And whenever you cast one of those 3, you get to loot. That adds up really fast. And then to a lesser extent, Umara Wizard, which is the 4 and a blue 4/3, and it gets flying when you cast one of those 3, but it also can just be a land. Another solid card for the deck. It's also a wizard itself, so that helps everything else. But boy, these payoffs are really, really good, particularly the Relic and the Rockslide Sorcerer. Those are insane.
Yeah, this deck is a deck based on uncommons more so than the Clerics deck, because look, the Clerics deck can assemble a decent deck out of commons and it wants a couple uncommons to bolster it, but it gets to pick up its key commons pretty easily. The Wizard deck, you're just not getting that many Royal Eruptions and Into the Royals, and those are your best commons. So in order to really end up in the Wizards deck, you're going to want at least one of the uncommons and usually more. But that is doable. I mean, when it comes together, this deck is awesome. Yeah. Rockslide Sorcerer, Relic Amulet, Numara Mystic are like head and shoulders above the other uncommons.
Yeah.
With Windrider being a really nice payoff for being in this deck. And Umara Wizard being a great card in the deck, but it's also a great card in every deck. So I don't expect to see that one particularly late.
Agree.
But one of the cool things about this deck is it's a lighter synergy deck. You could end up with a, quote, blue-red Wizards deck that has no Wizard synergies at all and is a very good deck. Because when you end up with, like, 2 Royal Eruptions, an Into the Royal, and 2 Tazim Royal Mages plus decent blue and red cards, like, your deck's already going to be awesome.
Yep.
The Wizard stuff is important because, again, we're always looking for opportunities to get more out of our cards and to get more out of the draft where you're like, ooh, 10th pick Chilling Trap, that's a reward. But, just keep in mind that a blue-red deck with all the good blue-red commons will still be pretty good. These colors always work so well together. They're one of the better color pairs historically, just in Limited, because of how well blue and red complement each other.
Yeah, this is one of the really good versions of it, too. Card type breakdown, 17 to 20 land still for this archetype. You can play anywhere from 9 to 15 creatures, I guess I would say. Like, this deck does typically... does often have fewer creatures than the other archetypes do or than a normal archetype would. Again, I don't want any combat tricks in this deck. That's not really the name of the game, though. If you had to run one, it's not a disaster. But I want a lot of removal and interaction. And so that can be cards like, of course, Royal Eruption and Into the Royal. But I also count interaction as, Chilling Trap, for example, or Glacial Grasp or things like that you're getting the extra triggers from, and they're also interacting with your opponent's board. That's really important. One of the things that can happen with this deck if you don't have enough of those things is they can race you. Like, you often are kind of setting up for this big turn a little bit later in the game, but if they just like curve out with a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, and maybe a couple of them are like landfall creatures, they can stomp you pretty hard. If you have a way to bounce a landfall creature, they can't win. Like they lose a landfall trigger, they have to replay their card, they might not have another one, and it just gets out of hand. So, again, it if you've played the format. Into the Royal, super important. But again, Chilling Trap, Glacial Grasp, those ones sub in for those reasonably well, and you want a bunch of those, so you make sure you hit enough instants and sorceries too. Do you have anything to add to that, Luis?
No, and this is one of those decks that if you've got enough good threats, don't be afraid to play a very creature light version of the deck.
Yeah.
Because I've had a deck where I had 2 Royal Eruptions and 2 Tazim Royal Mages, and I think I had 8 creatures total. But I didn't really have that much trouble closing because between Relic Amulet and my removal spells, I was able to neutralize most of their threats. I didn't need to get that many hits in before I did the sequence of kicked Royal Eruption, Royal Mage it back, kicked Royal Eruption. That's just 10 right there.
That's just absurd. Yeah.
So if you're a good enough control deck. Another card I wanted to note before we moved on is Field Research is solid in this deck. That's the divination.
Yes.
That if you kick it, it draws you 3. Same with Skyclave Plunder, the uncommon 5-mana draw 3.
Yep.
This deck, like the Clerics deck, does like some card advantage. So I'm looking to play a couple copies of those kind of effects, but in an ideal world, then you're getting your card advantage off Relic, Amulet, and Chilling Trap. Just sometimes, if you're on the more blue-red controlling side, you are going to want a couple card draw spells because you have the time to use them.
Yeah, and then cards you should be valuing higher or lower for the archetype. Chilling Trap you should be valuing way, way, way higher from basically 0 to a card you actually want. But like Luis mentioned, this is really important. Just because you value it higher doesn't mean you have to take it higher. If you get 1 second pick and there's even just like a Fisher Wizard or something that you could just use a 2-drop, you can take it. And most of the time you're going to wield the Chilling Trap. So that's the good news for you. The only deck that wants this, really the only deck is Wizard. So if it doesn't come back, it's a little bit of a bummer because it means not only is there other people in your colors, but they might be like in the exact same colors as you. But what are you going to do?
Unless they're drafting the ever powerful blue-green Wizards archetype.
Yes, that's right. And then I mentioned before, but Bubble Snare goes down a little bit from being like close to premium removal, basically, to being like if there's a tiebreaker on it, you may go the other direction. But as Luis mentioned before, and I agree with him, if it is in my pile, it's still going into my deck. I'm not going to cut it from a Wizards deck. It's just during the draft, it doesn't have quite the same pull that it does in the other because it doesn't trigger anything.
You'll end up in a spot where, you've got a Rockslide Sorcerer, a Relic Amulet, a Windrider Wizard, and you're looking at like Bubble Snare versus something like even Chilling Trap. And sometimes you're right. It's right to take the non-Bubble Snare option. Right. Of course, you're not going to cut it from your deck.
Right. Where in the next deck, you would never probably pass or cut it under any circumstance.
Yes.
And I think this is probably the second best archetype, Luis. In my experience, it's blue-green kicker. And this deck has basically like a nearly unbeatable late game. Like the kicker cards just add so much advantage to your side of the battlefield that it makes it really hard to beat in the super late game. But the cool part about it is because so many of the cards have kicker, they can still play a reasonable early to mid game where they get to cast spells. This takes advantage of kicker, unsurprisingly, in two ways, which is kind of interesting. One of them is just because kicker is a powerful limited mechanic. It allows you flexibility where, how many times have you drawn your 3-drop on turn 3 and been like, boom, I got there. But then you draw your 3-drop on turn 13 and you're like, well, this isn't that good. Well, guess what? You pay 3 or 4 extra mana and it is that good. You get a spell back from your yard or you bounce a creature. This deck has that built in because it's rewarding you for playing cards that do that. Then on top of it, it gets extra cool in that it rewards you for actually kicking the cards, and there's some really good payoffs for doing that as well. I love this deck, by the way, Luis. It's super fun to play. Yeah,
this deck is a really cool combination of it. It's kind of like a blue-green ramp deck, but it's got a little bit different things going on because you care about kicker in a way that's not just, I'm going to play all my expensive spells. And it has a lot of cool interactions, like Risen Riptide especially really changes kind of the texture of your games where sometimes you're like Risen Riptide, kick a Bubble Snare, and your opponent now is like, wow, I need to really watch out or I'm just going to die. Right. So you've got some cool stuff going on while also, I don't know, just getting to play like a deck with a lot of really high quality cards. And like you said, kicker naturally smooths things out where if you have to play a Gnarled Colony on turn 2, perfectly fine. It'll trade for their 2-drop. And then later in the game, you're playing a 5-mana 4/4 trample. But also maybe it's triggering 1 or 2 of your other cards, and all of a sudden you're just feeling really paid off at any point in the game here.
Yeah, and it's funny because if you told me what is it going to take for you to play all kicker cards in your deck, and I'm like nothing. Please, yes, exactly. I want to do that all the time.
It's like what this deck and the Blue-Red Wizards deck have in common that the Clerics deck does not is the Blue-Red Wizards deck is just good blue and red cards. The kicker deck is frequently just good blue and green cards. They happen to have synergies going on as well, and that's what makes the decks really pop. Yeah. But the black-white deck is not just good black and white cards. It's specific black and white cards that work together. Kicker gets the best of all worlds where its cards are good on their own and better when combined.
What do you think about the top commons? I had Into the Royal as the number one and kind of by itself common because it basically is creature interaction that triggers all your stuff and also pays you back by giving you the card.
For sure. Into the Royal is by far the best card for this deck, and one of the cards everyone else wants. So again, you kind of have to just be aware that you're competing with everyone for it.
Yeah, and then in the next tier, I have Gnarled Colony and Bubble Snare. So Bubble Snare is a kicker card that is a hard removal spell effectively, so that has obvious implications for the deck. And then Gnarled Colony seems to be one of the better threats that you can get. Just that flexibility of slamming it on turn 2 if you need a blocker to start, if it fits in your curve better, but then being able to cast it on turn 5 or whenever you have 5 mana. And it's a viable threat. And also the +1/+1 counter thing where your other creatures with +1/+1 counters get trample comes up more often than I thought it would. It's not just it. It has this static ability that's kind of annoying too for your opponent.
Yeah, that's definitely not just flavor text.
Right.
I think that I'm a little lower on Gnarled Colony. This kind of goes back to how we evaluated the cards for the black-white deck. Mm-hmm. Once I'm in the blue-green deck, I agree with the placement of Gnarled Colony here. Yeah. But if I don't know I'm necessarily going to be in the kicker archetype, I could see in general myself taking things like Cunning Geyser Mage or Tazim Royal Mage above Gnarled Colony, because I think those cards are a safer bet in general.
I did put these under within the context of the archetype, so that's how I'm viewing it.
Within the context of the deck, Gnarled Colony is really important. It's also one of your better curves, especially since both Royal Mage and the Cunning Geyser Mage and Field Research all cost 6 to kick. Having Gnarled Colony at 5, I think, is really good when you're on a 2 or 3 Risen Riptide deck, where that way you have something to play on 5 and something to play on 6, both of which let your Riptide attack.
That's right. Yeah. And so somewhere in that second tier, Bubble Snare, Gnarled Colony, and then the next tier is really powerful and good group of cards. Risen Riptide, of course, is a really important one. This is your kicker payoff here at Common, right? This is the card that pays you off. You get a 5/5 for 3 that's a good blocker when it's not being kicked, and it smashes super, super hard when you are kicking cards. And you can just send it into the red zone, and there's nothing that can compete with this card outside of the dreaded 1/1 Death Touch for green. That's the only card that, in the first 3 or 4 turns, it actually tussles with the Riptide when it becomes a 5/5. Cunning Geyser Mage that you mentioned a second ago, Luis, really important. Rabid Bite, right? It's just removal, so it's in here somewhere. And then I really like Tazim Royal Mage. Really, in any deck that can cast it, I found it to be really strong, and this deck counts for sure.
Yeah, I like all of these cards. It's worth noting that Risen Riptide is your Chilling Trap. It's your card that no one else wants. That's a solid 7 to 8 out of 10 in this deck.
Yep.
When you've got it fully enabled, but it's basically a 1 for everyone else. So this is where you pick up your value. And this means that I'm picking Risen Riptide a little lower than these other cards, just because I'm going to try to wheel it. If I don't wheel it, it's usually not a great sign anyway.
Right. There you go. Field Research is kind of in a tier where it's a card you can definitely play in the deck. It triggers kicker stuff, so that's good, and it's just a solid card anyway. And then kind of at the more bottom end of the stuff that I put in the deck, Spell Shield, which we talked about for the Crack-a-Pack. Reclaim the Waste. You turned me onto that card, and I've been able to leverage that to some pretty cool stuff. I kind of looked at it if I'm not splashing, I don't want it. But I've started to play it a little more, especially if I have loot effects or anything like that. Then Reclaim the Waste seems to get a bit better. And then, it's a low downside card to have in your deck anyway. It just, replaces itself or whatever. So that's nice. And then where did you end up landing on Skyclave Sentinel, the 3-mana 2/3 flying defender, but you can kick it for 7 total to give it a couple of counters, and then it doesn't have defender?
I like Skyclave Sentinel. It's one of those cards that it gives you a lot of late game punch. It is weak on 3 mana. And so it's not a card I'm necessarily looking to play a bunch of. It's worth noting that if it gets a counter from any source, it can attack. Mm-hmm. So if you've got Dauntless Survivors in your deck or any other ways to grant counters, then Skyclave Sentinel can be a nice, play it on turn 3, give it a counter on turn 4, attack in the air with a 3/4 flyer. Mm-hmm. I also really do like Reclaim the Wastes. I think it's especially good with Vine Gecko because that's the natural 2/3 curve, and it gives you mana, so you can play your 7 mana spells, not miss any land drops. Plus the kicker thing means that it just even late game it can be relevant to trigger a Risen Riptide and get to attack. So I know I'm not out here fourth picking Reclaim the Wastes, but I'm pretty happy with that card in this deck. And also this deck can easily splash because sometimes you're just naturally on 2 copies of Reclaim the Waste. And also Vastwood Surge is a really powerful uncommon for the deck for multiple reasons. Mm-hmm. And these decks can easily splash a 3rd color. And one of my most common splashes is something like Kazul's Fury, a Coup Warrior, and a Royal Eruption, or maybe 2 if I'm lucky, plus a couple ways to search out your 1 mountain, and you end up with 6 red sources and, effectively only 2 red cards plus your flip cards.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then for the payoffs at Uncommon, Rooster Drake's is far and away your best payoff. It's not remotely close for the reasons we talked about in the Crack-a-Pack. But boy, you get some really good stuff. You get Marasa Sproutling. That's a 2 and a G 3/3, and you can kick it for 1 and a G to get a card with kicker back from your graveyard. And that's
oh yeah,
that gets you other creatures back. That gets you a lot of really powerful stuff.
Two of them can return each other.
Yeah, they can do the little dance. So
the classic combo is playing Vastwood Surge on turn 4, getting 2 lands, and then next turn, or even just a couple turns later, Sproutling, getting it back so you can play it kicked and give your whole squad a bonus.
Oh, that's nasty, right? And then also at Uncommon, you get Vine Gecko, which is the 1 and a green. This one's kind of interesting because it makes your first kicker spell each turn 1 cheaper, and every time you cast a kick card, you get a +1/+1 counter on the Gecko. So it's really pure payoff. There's no enabling happening here. It doesn't have kicker itself. It doesn't trigger other kicker cards. It just enables the kicker cards that you do have in your deck. But holy smokes. When somebody plays this on turn 2, you're like, oh no, he's going to be a 4/4 and I'm going to get smashed. And you just feel like you're going to get stomped, because when they start casting the 6 mana kicker cards, which you mentioned, the Cunning Geyser Mage, the Tazim Royal Mage, and the Field Research are kind of your core there, turns early. It's ugly. It's just really nasty.
Vine Gecko is one of those cards that's not the easiest to use, but when you get it in a good deck like this, it's just really, really strong.
Then you've also got a couple of other powerful ones, like Merfolk Falconer, which is the 3/blue 4/4 flyer, and it lets you scry 2 when you kick a card. And that's that's not some game-ending payoff, but it's a solid bonus at the time when you actually have a Merfolk Falconer on the battlefield, because at that point, you usually know what you want. Like, I have too many lands, I want to get those out of here, or I need one more land so I can start kicking my 6 mana kickers or whatever. So really powerful at that stage of the game. Scrying in the mid to late game is really good and limited because you can control your land density in your hand. And they're tacking it onto a perfectly great card anyway. It's just 4/4 flyer for 5. And then you also get Lull Mage's Familiar, which is a 1 green blue 2/4, and it taps for green or blue, and you gain 2 life whenever you cast a kicker card. And that has all the things you want. It's a good blocker. It ramps you to your kicker stuff, and it even helps keep you alive when you do start kicking stuff. So Familiar's great in the deck too.
Yeah, the only note I have is that Merfolk Falconer isn't exactly a kicker payoff as much as just a card that's going to go into any blue deck, though it is at its best in this deck. But
it does pay you off when you kick a spell, though, right? Just I was right about that.
It does. Okay, whenever you play a kick spell, scry 2, but you'll always play this in your Wizards deck.
It's really
this
good
isn't a card that specifically I think of as a kicker payoff as much as just a good blue uncommon, though of course it is better in this deck than others.
Okay, I mean, I guess when it says whenever you kick a spell, I'm likely to put it in.
It definitely makes sense.
Yeah, but but I agree, it goes into any blue deck no matter what. Card types, you can lean a little heavier on the lands here. You can get up into the 18 to 21, even 22 if you have enough of the modal double face cards here. You don't want to miss land drops in this deck. You just want to play lands every turn.
I think the name modal double faced is an abomination and should never have been said.
What should we call them? I've been calling them land spells, but that sounds stupid too.
I like spell lands.
Spell lands. Okay.
Spell lands flows better, or flip lands. I think are both fine, but modal double-faced cards is like the kind of thing you use in the back end when you're talking, like when you're working on the set and you don't have a name for it, or as your technical speak, or maybe in the rules documents. That's fine too.
You're a programmer on Arena.
You really should. I really don't even think that should have been a public-facing name that was revealed as much as possible. It's just such a bad name.
It is a little technical. Anyway,
the MDFCs.
When you're MDFC ETBs, you can. It's like, come on. But you can lean a little heavier on the lands in this deck because you actually have stuff to do basically all the time. This deck can play 14 to 16 creatures, which is kind of in the middle of the creature count range. Basically, as many of the kicker creatures as you can get. There aren't bad ones. I would prefer to play 0 combat tricks in this deck, but you can run a Might of Marasa. It's not necessary, but if you do put one in your deck, if you kick it, it does have a big effect, and it is a kicker card, so if you have enough of the payoffs, I get it. I will forgive you for it, and it's fine.
Go ahead. I do think that if you've got a couple Risen Riptides, Might of Marasa does get me a lot more interested. It's also nice with Gnarled Colony because of Trample.
True.
My only point is that this card goes from a card you might dismiss to a card you could actually play in this deck, even though historically we have not liked combat tricks in these synergy decks.
Right. And then, creature interaction, I mean, you're going to play as much as you can get. But this deck, between Into the Royal, Bubble Snare, and Rabid Bite, actually does have enough ways to interact. It's just enough, right? We're not talking about black-white levels of removal, but...
No, and Cunning Geyser Mage kind of does the same thing, too.
True. Yep, there you go. And so, again, big picture on the deck. Your deck isn't that slow because you're playing kicker, so you can still play stuff early in the game. But when you get to the late game, you just get to cast 6 drops for basically the rest of the game while your opponent draws their 2 drops on turn 13 or whatever. And you can pretty easily win the game once you get to that point, start kicking stuff. The card that you should be valuing higher for this archetype is definitely Risen Riptide. That's kind of your go-to.
Yeah, Risen Riptide is awesome.
Also, that deck is just sweet. Like, not just good, but it feels real
it's
fun.
also sweet because this deck can splash easily, so it can get all sorts of wild stuff going on. I played 4-color versions of it. Once you have like 2 Vastwood Surges and 2 Reclaims, the sky kind of is the limit. Another sub theme I've liked is having like 1 Kazandu Stomper to pick up your modal double-faced cards.
Your MDFCs, you mean?
Yeah.
That's really good too.
That ends up working out pretty nicely, and this is the kind of deck that can really utilize all their mana in that way.
Yeah, I love the deck, and I thought what you said was really summed it up nicely, because if you told me, okay, there's a new set coming out, there's a blue-green archetype, what does it do, right? I would say it ramps, right? Blue-green ramp is kind of the default archetype, some version of ramp. But this is a really cool version and a better one than we normally see, because that one often has the problem of you need to get some balance of ramp cards plus big payoffs. And if you draw them in the wrong order, you don't do anything. And with blue-green, it can be really difficult to stay alive because you often don't have good enough removal to kill your opponents, like evasive threats or, really fast starts or whatever. And this really shores all of that up. Kicker mechanic just in general makes it so that dynamic of I don't have anything to do early because I drew my expensive cards is just gone. You just don't need to play expensive cards. All your cards are cheap and expensive. And then, you get this extra synergy thing kind of thrown in. And then on top of it, the interaction and the removal is actually just pretty good. Like, Bubble Snare is above tier for blue removal by a lot. Like how many times have you cast a 4-drop on turn 5 and they had attacked you with their 5-drop or 4-drop or whatever, and then you're just like Bubble Snare it, and they're just like, oh my god, like this board just went from me being ahead to me being way behind because you double spelled on that turn, and Bubble Snare, is one of the better reasons to do it, and then you get one of the premium commons with Into the Royal as well.
4.
Okay, 4 what? 4 times that's happened?
I've done it 4 times.
You've done it 4 times. Very nice. Did you just look that up? Maybe I do need one of these trackers for Arena or whatever. By the way, before we go, should we mention that I got an email from CFB about a partnership thing. Is that something we should talk about here?
Oh, with 17 lands?
Yeah, that seems like something that would be up our alley. What's up with that?
Yeah, so basically,
I don't want to put you on the spot, Luis. I didn't ask you about this first, but
I don't know a ton about it. I mean, we are working with them, and they do some cool stats based stuff where basically they try to get they try to analyze games, like any of these trackers, right? You kind of install them, and it'll save a bunch of data from your arena games. And first of all, it's totally fine to use these. Untapped GG is another one, by the way, which I think is quite good. They're both in the kind of the same realm, and then what they can do, what they get out of it is stats. So they can say stuff like, well, the decks that had 19 lands won more on average than decks that had 17 lands or whatever it is. Or it's always tricky with analytics with this stuff when you don't have access to all the information because, of course, Wizards has access to all the information being played. And I can speak to this because of my work with Direwolf on Eternal, where we had access to a ton of info, right? Mm-hmm. And it's always tricky. So one way to kind of fall into a trap that I think most people have realized at this point is, well, what do you think, Marshall, if I told you the win rate of cards when cast? How useful do you think that data would be?
When cast? Not very useful. Yeah, because like anytime a card costs like 8 mana, if it's cast, it's going to win you the game. The thing I'm worried about is when I don't get to cast it, right?
Right, exactly. And that's a common one. I remember that people initially were all like, wow, look at this card. It's kind of like when Wrap in Flames gets cast, its win rate is absurd. That's right. Make 3 creatures unable to block. Because, those cards only get cast in games where you win with them. Yeah. So I think a better way to look at it is like when this card is in your deck, what is your win rate? And from there, you can get a lot of good information.
I see. But you need a ton of data for that. Oh, that's interesting.
Right. Analytics is really cool, and using an arena tracker can get you more data, and you can make decisions about deck building and what to pick once you start looking at that data. Plus, it gets you a lot of your own personal stats. So I think that stuff can be really awesome.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. We'll figure out a bit more about what 17 Lands is doing with CFB and stuff, and we'll get back to you on it. But in the meantime, I will put a link in the show notes to 17 Lands Twitter account. You can also just go to 17lands.com, the number 17lands.com. And And you can check it out. It's a MTG arena tracker with a focus on limited magic. It says in their profile. Yeah. I haven't installed it on mine, but I probably will today, and we can talk about it.
It's really cool to get to see your personal stats and keep track of it in a way that every now and then Arena will send you an email with this info, but this gives you more detailed stats and more real time. Yeah. And this is something that's really common among online games. You know, if you play Hearthstone, then everyone uses deck trackers. If you play Hearthstone Battlegrounds, it's actually really cool. So I don't know if you know how Battlegrounds works.
So it's funny, I've been watching Battlegrounds. This is so absurd, Luis. So the late night Among Us crew, your crew, like the ones on the sus station, when the game breaks, like Mani and Dokamoy and Nerably and Phil, they will go play Battlegrounds. I have no idea what this is, and I just watch them play and kind of hang out because those guys, they don't even know I'm there, but they are so funny. They just trash on each other the whole time because they're playing against each other. But I noticed at the top of the screen the other night when I was watching that it literally said what their win percentage was from that point in the game. It's like we're 99.1% to win this game. Is that the tracker you're talking about?
Yeah, so how Hearthstone Battlegrounds works, it's really funny, is you it's one of these auto battlers where you buy different units and you put them on the battlefield, and then when the buy phase is over, you fight another team. And the way it works is your leftmost minion attacks first, and then your next one, and then your next one, and it changes off. So first your leftmost minion attacks, then theirs does, and they attack randomly. And the way these trackers work is they'll it's really ingenious, actually. They run a bunch of simulations of the team you have against their team to give you percentages of how likely you are to win, lose, or draw that battle.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's wild.
That's crazy. And that's because they can do that because it's automated. Like,
yes,
you couldn't do that in real time in Magic because it's too variable.
Because the reason these things are auto battlers is once the battle starts, it's automatic. You have no input.
Gotcha.
The only decisions you make are positioning, which happens before the fight, and who to buy and what to sell, which determines the composition of your army. So, but once the fight starts, it's all automatic, which is why they get to run their simulation to figure out exactly what your percentage chance to win, lose, or draw is. And that you can't have for Magic because, like, me and you sit down and the decisions we make change the outcome of all those things. Right. It's really hard to get a percentage on two different decks battling, but I think that having these trackers is pretty cool for a lot of these games. And it's one of the big advantages for being digital is getting to see all this stuff and getting to kind of a little peek. Of course, every game you kind of have to worry about how much data is being exposed to the players because too much and actually could lead to some bad things. And of course, you have to store a lot of what's going on server side so people don't hack and get to stack their deck or any of or get to look at what's in their opponent's deck or any of the illegal things. But so far, I believe Arena's avoided that.
Okay, well that's really cool, and I will. I'll put a link to 17 Land's Twitter in our show notes this week if anybody wants to check it out and try it out, and let us know. Let us know if you like it, what you liked about it, that kind of stuff. And I just love that there's people that are doing this, that are working on these things for us limited players.
All the stuff is just so clear. Clearly, it starts because people are passionate about the game and they want to find new ways to optimize their experience and develop these cool tools. And if you don't want to use them, that's totally fine. But I honestly see nothing wrong. We were not, for example, forbidden to use any kind of deck tracker or any of those things or stat tracker during the grand finals or any of these online tournaments because they don't get access to any information that you're not supposed to get as a player sitting there.
Right.
It can tell you stuff like what your percentage is to draw a land, but technically you could figure that out too, given the tools you have. Mm-hmm. This just does it in an easier way, and I think that that's totally fine.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for the most part, the hard part about playing Magic, when you think in the way that we teach on the show, like what you just said, isn't the figuring it out. You can memorize that part. Right? You can memorize the percentages on the play on the draw of hitting your third land drop if you keep a 2-lander and stuff. The hard part is, how do you use that information?
Not even memorizing the percentages. You can just know that, hey, it's okay to keep 2-landers on the draw.
Yes.
And
that's a heuristic you can just have.
Know what the number is. Yeah. So I find that these don't go against what I consider good competition.
Okay. Well, I'll check that out too, and like I said, I'll put it in the show notes. That's going to do
it. It'll give you some great data on like you're using the Hearthstone auto battle. You're like, I just lost a fight. I was 5% to lose, 95% to win. This is just complete, utter BS.
Yeah, totally. I know. Like, I feel like this is really bad for people that tilt, right?
Yes.
Like it'll tell, I literally was 4% and my opponent got there or whatever. It's like, oh no, more ammo.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. I want to remind you about our sponsor, Channel Fireball. If you need to buy or sell cards, you can go to Channel Fireball. You can sell cards a few different ways over there now. You can go on to their buy list, pick the exact cards that you have in the condition that you have them, and get an idea for what they're selling, what they're paying for each of those cards, then package them up and send them in. Or if you've just got a big box of cards that's taking up space in the closet and you'd rather just turn it into money or store credit or whatever, you can do U-Box We Buy, and you just put them in the box, send them in, and then the employees over at CFB down in California will sort through them and they'll make you an offer on your collection. You can take it or leave it at that point, and it's just that easy. So you can check out both of those ways to sell your cards back to Channel Fireball over at channelfireball.com. That is going to do it for this week's episode. We'll be back with more next week. Are you stealing sign-offs from BK? Don't lie to me, Luis.
Wait, what?
There's a wild rumor flying around that you have stolen your sign-offs from your Constructed Resources co-host, Andrew Beckstrom, for weeks in a row now. Is this true?
No, that's definitely not true. And sometimes he copies my sign-offs, and you know what? I'm being the bigger man here. I'm taking the high road and kind of letting him do that. If he doesn't want to think of his own material, I'm really not one to shame him for it. That being said, now that we're in a kind of world where we're not traveling that much, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the places I've lived and what I've liked most about them. So
he's in the chat, right?
Well, I don't really know what that has to do with anything.
Okay.
Here.
All right, Luis. I want to hear about where you've lived. I mean, I know the answer, but I want to hear it.
So, I was born in Oakland, California, and I actually didn't move away until college. So I lived my first 18 years there in Oakland. I love Oakland, still do. And, I got into UC Davis, University of California, Davis. Davis is about an hour or so outside of Oakland. It's right next to Sacramento, which is the capital of California, though not the top of the list in terms of cities.
The gleaming
for
capital
most
of
folks.
California. Yeah, I like Sacramento, but it is tough to compete with like San Francisco, right. Oakland, LA, San Diego, like.
Yeah, Sacramento's totally fine. I said, I lived, 10 minutes outside Sacramento for, a solid chunk of 7 years or so. But I think that the thing I like most about Oakland, for me, really is that's where I'm from, like in a way that's like very important to me. I know when I go back and visit, it definitely feels like home. A lot of my family's there. A lot of my early memories are there, of course. A lot of my memories as an adult are there. So, Oakland's awesome. Plus, it has just like a lot of sweet Mexican food that a very high plus for me.
Yeah.
And then I went to Davis, and I was in Davis for my college time, plus stayed there for a couple years afterwards. Ended up just living there for a couple years afterwards. And Davis always will kind of stay in my mind and heart as where I became good at Magic, because this is a period of time when I started playing Magic again. I had quit Magic and actually kind of wandered into the local store. Local stores are important, without me wandering in and looking for something to do during my lunch break when I was working on campus over the summer and had most of my friends had gone home. I don't know where I'd be right now. I honestly don't. Learned how to play there. The store was the End Zone, though that store has long since passed, unfortunately. And this is where I met a lot of my friends who are still really close friends today. I lived with Eirik, Matt, and Ryan, 3 friends of mine, and I still talk to those guys. You've met Eirik and Matt because they come to tournaments every now and then. They come out, hang out, play Among Us with them. And then that's where I met Chion too. He wasn't in Davis. He was in Southern California, but we met at PTQs. The first time we met was at a pro tour, his first pro tour, my second. We did a bunch of team drafts actually against Cedric, which is funny. A little footnote there. We beat him every time, of course, but we ended up, he ended up moving in with all of us. Me, Eirik, Matt and Cheon all lived together. He lived on our couch actually for a solid year and a half. And
you mean Neon Cheon?
Yep, this was Neon Cheon, as he was
said
known
that was his
days.
nickname back then.
Yep, Neon Cheon was definitely his nickname. And this is when I went from, I think, being decent at Magic to being really, really good at Magic. And it, like, the two main, I think, inflection points, or not even inflection points, the two main times when my Magic skills really leveled up, this was the first one, the year where we just lived, breathed, and ate Magic, to the detriment of my studies, unfortunately, though. As things have turned out, I haven't really regretted that. This poli-sci degree hasn't really done a whole lot for me in terms of opening doors. Though I appreciate the knowledge I've gained. As someone who does a lot of writing, I've written a lot in my life. It has certainly helped me learn how to write and constructively think and all that stuff. But definitely got a lot better at Magic. Then I moved back to Oakland for a couple years. Lived right near my family. And then I got a job opportunity in Denver and moved there to work at Direwolf. And that was now 8 years ago.
I still can't believe how long ago that was.
You remember, like, I told you, I'm like, I'm moving to Denver. And you're like, oh, awesome, cool. Why are you doing that? And we talked about it.
Yeah, I remember when you told me.
It's like a decade ago now.
Yeah. And I was surprised that you were moving. And that was so long ago now. It's crazy. Yeah.
So, that's where I've been since. And I think that my favorite thing in Denver is kind of the community we've been able to build here, because me and all my friends here who are here, none of us are native to here. And that's true of Denver in particular. There's a lot of transplants. It's funny that there's like a whole like native Denverites versus not, that some people kind of get into that mindset, though I really haven't run into it, which is lucky, because I think it's kind of nonsensical. Like, I don't know. The fact that a lot of people move to your city might mean your city's great. Isn't that cool? Like,
right.
Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah.
But the community here with, like, Gabby's here and Matt Nass is here and BK and Sam and Caroline and and Josh McLean and Justin, all these folks who I like play D&D with and play Magic with. And it's really cool living out here. So,
well, you did that,
Yeah, I did.
Like, you are just this magnetic person who somehow convinced your entire friend group to move from around the country to Denver to work and live with you. It's like incredible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I put in the hours. I did the work.
Big networking going on.
Yeah, a little networking. But you know what? I think that in general, the things I care about places, the consistent theme is the people. Like, it's home is what you make of it. And I feel like I'm pretty lucky to have a lot of folks. And I know you've got like a great community in Seattle as well, even though Woody somehow escaped your grasp. So
did, yeah. Did you mention Beckstrom in that list of people that you like to hang around with there?
BK's awesome, yeah. Did I not mention him? That was unintentional.
I don't think you mentioned Andrew Beckstrom, your co-host.
I certainly meant to, because BK's awesome.
Maybe you did, and I didn't hear it. But
I will say that getting to know BK better and becoming really good friends with him is one of the things I've liked the most about the last couple of years. So
BK is straight gasoline, like high octane.
I unreservedly think he is awesome. There's no hidden beats there.
Yeah, I watch him on Among Us. It's him and Monty. Like, when you're not in there, are my one and two people to watch their screen, because it's just funny. But anyway.
Yeah. So, I thought that was interesting. And one little note to those of you who made it all the way here: Channel Fireball is no longer in California. We're now in Nevada. So the warehouse did actually move. But
it did move. I remember you had mentioned that a while ago. Okay, cool. Good to know. Good to know.
So if you just sent a bunch of cards to Nevada and you were worried that Marshall said they were going to California, don't worry. You got it right. Yeah. If you just sent a bunch of cards to California, well, maybe you should, at that point, you should figure it out. Though, they've taken care of all that, of course. Should
I do my where I've lived?
Oh, I think that would be something that'd be very interesting to talk about. Though it's not going to be quite as long.
No, I've lived in Seattle my whole life. That's it. That's my whole story.
But Seattle's awesome. So it's not, it ain't no thing. Like,
I know I want to move because it's cheaper to live elsewhere and I can kind of do my job from anywhere, but I love it here. So I'm really torn. It's really tough.
But like, that's definitely true, but to some degree, it's not just about cost of living. And you are, of course, lucky enough that you can afford to live in Seattle. And I don't know, I feel like it's a good investment in happiness,
Agreed.